Hi, I'm Matty Smith and I'm going to talk to you today about over-under photography and share a few tips with you on how I achieve my favourite over-under pictures. So I'll be covering equipment mostly aimed at DSLR users because of the versatility of that kind of camera and the equipment we need to create an over-underwater photograph. So I'll be covering things like dome port sizes, the best lenses to use, exposure, and where to focus to get the best sharp image. So the first tip I want to share with you is dome port size and selection. When we're shooting over underwater pictures using a DSLR camera, our camera will be inside some kind of waterproof housing or case. And on the front of that housing we'll be putting dome ports in which the lens shoots the picture through. And these dome ports are generally made out of glass or acrylic, and they come in many different sizes. So this is quite a large dome port. This is a 9.25, which is a glass port, which is commonly bought off the shelf by a lot of underwater photographers, and this is a 4-inch dome port, another glass one, a lot smaller, and has its own advantages and disadvantages. So first I'm going to talk about the advantages of the small 4-inch port. This is one of my favourites for shooting small over-under subjects such as baby turtles or small jellyfish or anything small that might live its life on the surface of the ocean. Now generally when we're shooting over under pictures we're going to be using a fisheye or a wide angle lens, which I'll talk about a little later on. But the advantage of this small port is it allows us to bring the subject very, very close to that fisheye lens. As we know, when we look through a fisheye or a wide-angle lens, it makes small subjects appear even smaller and further away. So we need to reduce that physical distance and bring them close enough to the camera lens to create a nice frame-filling and detailed shot. So the disadvantages really with this port is if you want to take a photograph of a large vista, maybe you've got a beautiful coral reef and an island in the background with some palm trees, this port is going to give us some focus issues. We're not going to be able to focus and get depth of field on the underwater part of the photograph and the trees and the island in the background because of the refraction this creates. When water touches this very curved surface, it creates a very, very magnified optical illusion appear under the water, which is not good for big subjects. Another disadvantage with a small port like this is you can only really shoot in very, very calm waters. If you can imagine that I've got the waterline here on the port and it's a rough sea, the waterline is going to be up and down, up and down. It's going to be very, very hard to control through the centre of the shot with a small dome like this. The next port I'm going to talk about is this one. So this is a 9.25 inch port, but anything from about 6 inches upwards is better for wider angle shots. So landscapey type shots of reefs and ocean and islands and palm trees and people swimming under the water or seals or anything like that. I would generally go for a port of around this dimensions. The 6 to the 9 inch dimensions are probably more suited to this, and these can be bought readily from any underwater photography shop, or a lot of housing manufacturers make these. They're a standard size port. A great advantage with a bigger port over the smaller 4-inch port is what I was talking about with the waterline. Now you can see we can control that waterline a lot easier because the waterline across the centre of this port has to move a lot further before it goes out of frame. So we're not going to be under and over and ducking all around in rougher seas. This is going to control the ripple of a more choppier sea a little bit better. Also with a bigger port like this, the refraction on the underwater part of the image isn't quite so intense. So the underwater part of the image appears a little bit further away to the camera, which makes it easier to control the focus. So we get greater depth of field throughout the image, so it's easier to get the coral nice and sharp and the trees and the island in the background nice and sharp. Another advantage of a slightly bigger port like this one is the waterline is not quite so obtrusive in the shot. Because it's further away from our wide angle lens, it appears a lot thinner and a lot sharper in the image. It's not occupying so much of the frame space as it is with a smaller 4-inch port. The only disadvantage with a slightly bigger port like this, the 9.25, is the proximity. If we're shooting a very small subject with a fisheye lens like the small jellyfish or the baby turtle, we can't get the subject physically close enough to create a frame-fitting shot. So that's when I would reach for the 4-inch port. But generally, this is a good all-rounder for over-under photography. So as a quick recap, unless we're shooting very, very small subjects, the golden rule of thumb is basically the bigger the dome port, the easier it is to control the refraction in the water and hence the depth of field and the front to back sharpness of the image. And for that reason, I actually developed and built my own 16.8 inch dome port, which is a huge monster of a thing to use, but it does give me some fantastic advantages with thin water lines, good depth of field, sharp images, and use in quite choppy, rough seas because it's really good to control that water line. So another great tip when shooting over underwater photographs is lens selection, which is very important. And I use two different types of lenses. I might use a 16 to 35mm rectilinear lens, or I might use an 8 to 15mm lens like this one, which is a fisheye lens. The advantage of using wide-angle lenses with over-underwater photography is generally when we're shooting an over-underwater picture, we're trying to create a landscapey type shot. So it might be a beautiful vista of a coral reef in shallow water, and we might have an island or some storm clouds in the background and maybe a swimmer swimming over the reef under the water. So we want to capture that entire vista, and a wide-angle lens or a fisheye lens does that really, really well. It also gives us a lot better depth of field or distance of focus into the photograph. So with a wide angle or the fisheye lens selection, we're going to get nice sharp foreground detail of the swimmer or the reef or the shark or whatever it is that you're trying to photograph. And we're also going to get a nice pin sharp waterline in the back, horizon in the background, clouds, trees, all that. We're going to get a full range of focus all the way through the photograph, which makes the over-underwater picture really pop and makes it really eye-catching. Tip number 3, exposure. How do you expose for an over-underwater photograph? Underwater generally is going to be 1 or 2 stops darker in light than above the water. So we're going to have generally a quite bright sky and the reef might look a little bit darker underwater with the filtered light. So when it comes to exposure, what I will mostly do is I will set to manual exposure for the sky, and I might even underexpose slightly just to add a little bit of drama. So I might take a spot meter reading of the blue sky or a cloud and set my exposure for that. Then to control the underwater part of the exposure, I'll make sure I'm nice and close to the subject. So if it's a coral reef, try and shoot at low tide when you can, when the reef is very, very close to the surface. That way it's getting the most reflected light on it. And it also means we get quite close with our strobes. So when I'm shooting over underwater picture, I'll generally use some artificial light source as well, like strobes or some very, very bright constant light. And proximity increases the power of those lights. So if I can get nice and close to a coral reef at low tide and get plenty of light on it, I can really make the colours pop and balance that with my manually set exposure for the sky. A common tip you also hear about exposure with over-underwater photography is only shoot at lunchtime or between 11 and 1 when the sun's really high, but that's not necessarily true. Sometimes shooting at that kind of day, in my experience, creates lots of contrast and shadows on the reef or the subject underwater that I'm trying to shoot. So I actually like to shoot towards the ends of the day in that golden hour. I like to shoot at sunrise over unders, and I like to shoot at sunset in the evenings, using my strobes to light the underwater part of the photograph, and then using that beautiful, rich, warm, golden hour light to create interest in the top side of the photograph. So please don't forget that when you're shooting an over underwater photograph, it's important to have interest both topside and underneath to keep the viewer's attention and create a nice atmosphere in the photograph. Just as a landscape photographer usually focuses on something close in the foreground, like maybe a rock or a tree stump or some grass or something like that, we do exactly the same in over-underwater photography landscape shots. The reason we do this is depth of field always extends much further behind our point of focus than it does in front. So if we focus on something that's quite a long way away, the stuff in the foreground, the subject in the foreground is going to become quite soft with the background sharp. Whereas if we focus on the foreground, we're going to get the foreground nice and sharp, and that depth of field extends a lot further behind our point of focus. So generally when I shoot over underwater pictures, I will set my focus point quite low in the frame, so the camera is focusing on the underwater side of the image, the coral reef, the swimmer, the fish, the turtle, the shark, etc. And then I will let my depth of field take care of what's happening on the surface of the water. And by selecting an f-stop of around f11, f16 with a fisheye, maybe f22 if I'm using the 16 to 35 rectilinear lens. By using these narrow f-stops, I'm going to maximise my depth of field. By focusing underwater in the foreground, I'm going to maximise my depth of field, and I'm going to get a nice sharp photograph from front to back. However, by using these narrow f-stops, these f11s, f16s, f22s, what that's going to do is it's going to make my shutter speed suffer a little bit. My shutter speed is going to start to drop, which is okay if you're standing in waist deep water shooting over underwater photographs. But if you're out in the open ocean and you're trying to swim and the camera's taking a little bit of buffeting from the waves or the ripples on the surface of the water, we need to keep that shutter speed quite high, around 250ths of a second. So the trade-off for there is to bump your ISO up a little bit. So if you're shooting around f22, say, or f16 with a 250th of a second, your ISO might creep up to 640 to 800, something around that region, which with most cameras these days is quite doable. There's no problem with that. But just make sure your shutter speed does stay quite quick when you're not standing, basically, to shoot the photograph. So they're my top 4 tips to help you get in better over underwater photographs. I hope you learned something. If you did, please like and subscribe. It'd be great to hear from you in the comments below. What cameras do you use? What lenses do you find the best? Where are you shooting? What subjects are you shooting? Yeah. And tip number 4. Today.